Welcome to Health Matters, and what a beautiful day it is, so thanks for being here. My name is Jeff Traum. I'm a local resident, and I'm a member of Stanford Medicine's Community Council. I'd also like to welcome hundreds of folks who are joining us online live stream, and they're all over the world today. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everybody here and online that you may submit questions via a QR code that's on your program. If you're online, you'll see the QR code on your screen. And we'll have a live Q&A after Dr. Kado's remarks. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Deborah Kado, a geriatrician, co-director of Stanford Center on Longevity, and chief of geriatric research in the Department of Medicine. She will share some of her groundbreaking work and the work occurring at the Stanford Center of Longevity and discuss what we can do today to remain physically active and mentally sharp, reduce stress, improve sleep, and enhance our nutrition, all factors essential to healthy aging. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Kado.
Good morning. Well, that's a huge charge to accomplish in the next 20 or 30 minutes, but I'll do my best. And I also want to give a shout out. Hi, Mom and Dad. So it's a pleasure to be here. And today I'd like to start by asking you all a question. Do you consider aging to be a disease? So Dr. Laura Carstensen, the founder of the Stanford Longevity Center, and I co-teach a course to the Stanford students. And this is exactly the question that I asked them at the beginning of the course. And maybe no surprise, while there is a majority consensus, it's not complete. So why could aging be considered a disease? Well, with aging, if you get to be old enough, there is an increased risk for the onset of multiple chronic diseases. So scientists have postulated that if we could understand the underlying biological underpinnings of why we age, perhaps we could identify an upstream target that we could develop treatments for that could potentially halt or even reverse aging. On the other hand, why should aging not be considered a disease? Well, at least in humans, it is a universal process. So that would mean, by definition, we all have a disease. Also, the word disease has negative connotations. And if we consider aging a disease, then I think it really just serves to increase our implicit and explicit biases we have towards older people. Now, in 2010, the first baby boomers started reaching the age of 65. And billions of dollars are spent annually to try to address this what they consider a problem, actually, and whether it's in science or supplements you can buy online or various gadgets to help stave off aging or getting old. It's been interesting. So I'm a geriatrician by training, and my patients sometimes ask me, well, doctor, what supplements can I take to perhaps help my brain or my bones or my heart or my joints? What supplements should I take? And I will say that in most cases, my answer is very simple: none. Okay, I've been fortunate enough to be in this field for over 30 years now, so I've kind of seen the vicissitudes of people who come in and they really believe that they found the thing. They found what you need, and they've shown that if you give whatever this treatment to, say, worms, mice, even primates, this can extend lifespan. And this has resulted, with the government now not regulating supplements, that there are a lot of those things online that you can go out and purchase, spending easily $60 a month. And to their credit, these scientists often do what they believe in, right? But I will say that of all those things that I've watched over the years, none of those scientists are known for their extreme longevity. I'm just saying. Okay, and unfortunately, most of them have passed before the age of 80, which isn't even considered very old right now. So it is an issue. So if not supplements, what can help us now? So I'm going to digress a little bit, because I think in order to really think about longevity and the best science for longevity in this century, we have to consider that, okay, now children are born and can expect to maybe live 100 years. So if you go online, and this slide is courtesy of my colleague, geriatrician, famous writer, Dr. Louise Aronson, you'll get a chart like this, basically, which shows a lifespan from 0 to 100. And what you see is we have great language for infants, toddlers, children's, tweens, teenagers, late adolescents, young adults, then adults where, you know, hopefully maybe you decide to have a family, hopefully you're gainfully employed, and then, I don't know, retirement age, let's just pick an age out of a hat, 65, and then all you see is a wheelchair. Okay, and unfortunately, there's a lot of information missing, right? Once you turn age, even 60 in this chart, there's a lack of information. There's not even a language, really, that is used. And I think if we're really thinking about longevity and the science of longevity, we need to pay attention to, we have to develop a language. We have to develop an idea that actually science has shown us in studies that we've done of older persons that this is the most variable time in life, the most heterogeneous time. And yet, we don't really understand it. We have this image of someone, I guess, in a wheelchair. And this is kind of reflected in our medical profession. So as you can see down on the bottom part of that slide, usually pediatricians are the doctors who are trained to take care of children up to about the age of 20. And then internal medicine doctors there are about 120,000 of them in primary care who are taking care of the general health of an adult, maybe up to the age of 65, and geriatricians are then specially trained to take care of adults beyond the age of 65 in their older years. And you can see that while there are 120,000 internal medicine doctors, there are less than 5,000 or 6,000 now, about 5,500 in 2023 practicing geriatrics across the country. And Jeff, who introduced me, had asked me when we were preparing for this, well, how many patients is that per doctor? So I decided to look it up, and based on the data I could get online, maybe 1,700 patients per pediatrician, 2,700 patients per internal medicine doctor, and almost 12,000 per one geriatrician. And that's likely an underestimate if you take 65 and how fast we're crossing that threshold of getting into our older years, or perhaps the last third of our lives. I want to give a shout out to family practice doctors. They're actually trained to take care of patients across the spectrum from 0 all the way up until one passes away. But because they have so much to take care of, unless they get specialized training in the treatment of the older adult, often they don't get the pearls that we need. And why is that? Well, it turns out in medical school across the country generally, and this is from when I was in training, you get 6 weeks of intensive pediatric training exposure. I've been querying the Stanford Medicine residents as they've come through since I came here in 2021, and it's very variable. And most medical schools, I would say, don't have a standardized mandatory geriatric education. And here at Stanford, just in 2021, we now have 4 hours of mandatory geriatric education in the first year. And for internal medicine residents here, they get 2 weeks of exposure in their first year, but those 2 weeks of exposure to what we do can be jeopardized, meaning if someone else gets sick or they, whatever happens, they get pulled and they don't get any geriatric exposure to see what geriatricians do and why they're special. So clearly we have a problem. We don't have enough. So Mary Tonetti, a fellow geriatrician from Yale in 2017, started with the Institute of Health Care Improvement and the John A. Hartford Foundation to say we need to do something. We're having a crisis in healthcare. We don't have enough of us, and the population is getting older every day. So they came up with the concept of let's try to develop what we call age-friendly health systems. We need age-friendly health care. And what does that mean? We got to try to make it simple, because it's not simple. But anyway, we're going to focus on 4 things. And we call them the 4 M's. 1, what matters? 2, mobility, because without mobility, people are less likely to be independent. And a lot of people, if you ask what matters to them, they really would like to be independently living if possible. 3, mentation. Are they able to do things and carry out their activities of what they have done all of their lives? How is their memory functioning, et cetera? And then lastly, the 4th M is medications. Because as we age, we tend to accumulate pills. And there are multiple studies that suggest that the more medications you take, the less healthy you might become. It's not a great marker of longevity. So. I'm going to now move on to some of the exciting science, and just chose 2 areas which I've been working since arriving to Stanford. And you can imagine that, gosh, in the 21st century, we are sending spaceships out into space, deep space, and we have self-driving cars. So what about ankle rockets? Or as they're called scientifically, ankle exoskeletons. So collaborating with my colleague here, a professor of mechanical engineering, Professor Steve Collins, who's the director of the Stanford Biomechatronics Laboratory. There is a booth out there if you want to go see this later on today. But he has been very interested in this topic of aiding walking with these ankle exoskeletons. And he started with younger adults and athletes and showed, and has just published in Nature this year, that these can be used and result in you walking about 40% faster and requiring 40% less energy. So that was really intriguing to me when I learned of his work, because a lot of my patients do complain about fatigue, and we know that in multiple large studies that we tend to get slower as we age, and that walking speed is a predictor of important health outcomes. It's associated with being, if you walk faster, you're probably likely to survive longer, for example. So right now, for the past 2 years, we decided to try to apply his technology in older adults. And here we have a picture of his specialized treadmill in his laboratory. And what we see is that that treadmill is not like the one you see at the gym. This treadmill moves when you move. And you can see a line in between, which means that each foot is moving the one side on its own. So it's kind of independently moving. And this man is donning on one of these masks to measure his metabolic rate. So what we found is in our 10 adults, older adults, all over the age of 65, we found very similar results in that their gait speed increased and their metabolic efficiency also increased. So it required less energy to walk faster. But what we found also was what we see in other studies when we bother to look at older people, and that the results were more variable. They weren't as uniform, supporting this idea that there's a lot of heterogeneity if you're lucky enough to get to be an older age. So we are now have submitted submitted a grant to hopefully expand this study, to develop this technology, to be able to offer in the future, maybe not the too distant future. And I actually donned these exoskeleton boots because I really didn't have a great idea of what was going on. But in one session, he said I was a fast learner. I walked much faster. I didn't put on the mask. But it feels kind of like ice skating. If you've ever been ice skating, it feels weird at first, not so comfortable. But then after a while, you don't even know, and you're walking that much faster, and it's kind of cool. All right, so the second area that I'd like to spend time talking about, I actually started when I was back in UC San Diego, and I'm very fortunate to be part of a very large study of older men that started back in 2000. They had to be 65 when they entered that study, and it was a study for osteoporosis. But in 2014, about 1,000 of them agreed at the fourth clinic visit to donate their stool for study. And I'm going to share some of the results from those older men, because there's a lot going on in the microbiome, but not so much in the oldest old. And so this is a very unique data that we have and have been able to work with. So why gut microbiome? Well, I think for most people, I'm going to put this under the category of what matters. Like maybe if you're regular with your excrement every day, you don't think about it, but if you get too much diarrhea, that's definitely not good, and if you get too much constipation, it's not good. So, and a lot of us have experienced either of those things at one point in our lives. So, Professor Rob Knight from UC San Diego is a world expert in the microbiome, all things microbiome, the microbiome of cheese, the microbiome of your skin, but also the microbiome of your gut. And he taught me that it's estimated that we have about 39 trillion microbial cells on our body, and most of those microbial cells exist in our gut. It's estimated that humans have about 30 trillion cells. So if you counted us as human by the percentages of cells we have, we'd be about 43% human. Likewise, with the advance of being able to do DNA sequencing, we estimate that there are about 20 to 20,000 microbial genes. And for humans, maybe 2,000. So if we count ourselves as human by the amount of genes we have, we would be considered about 1% human. But this is actually not a trivial point in that it suggests that if we look at this by genes and how can we change things to live a healthier, longer life, maybe we can change the microbial genes that exist within us. And that would be a lot easier than DNA editing of our own genome. So with increased longevity, we have really seen, you've heard probably in the beginning of the 1900s, estimated life was somewhere around 50 expectancy, and that's more than, about close to doubled. And why is that? Why are we living longer? Well, I think we can really credit the invention of antibiotics and vaccines. And with these two things, we've really been able to, most of us, survive into adulthood. But with that industrialization, there has become a microbial crisis. So we're not getting so many infections, except the pandemic thing, so many infections, but we have seen an increase in obesity, diabetes, chronic diseases, heart disease, cancer, et cetera. And some of those things have been linked to the gut microbiome. So what did we see in these men? These men, one of the things I do is bone health, so I was very curious to see a lot of my patients who come to see me say, well, doc, how much calcium should I take? And I know that vitamin D is important to absorb the calcium, so my patients actually gave me the idea to ask that question. So we looked at the vitamin D levels in these men, and also the active hormone vitamin D. So the one you get checked by your doctor is this storage form, and what we found in these men is the storage form of vitamin D that your doctor measures to say you're deficient or sufficient had nothing to do with the microbiome. It was a flat line. But the active hormone that we know that binds the receptors in the gut, the vitamin D receptor, was very highly correlated with a better gut microbial health, meaning that there was a wider range of bacteria. They were more diverse in their guts, and also particular types of bacteria that went along with a higher level of the active hormone of vitamin D. Also, with collaborators, we looked at kind of health and longevity in these older men. And what we found was that the men who were in the top third of their class, and there were 84 at this time, meaning that they self-reported their health as being good, they could walk faster, they got around, they had much better life space mobility, and they were on fewer medications. Those men not only survived longer, the gut microbiomes were also healthier, meaning more diverse. And the last study that just came out this spring, we looked at sleep in these men. We had armbands that they wore for a week, and we looked at their sleep patterns. And in fact, what we found was a signal where the men who had the most diverse gut microbiome were also the ones who had better regular sleep. They had sleep regularity, meaning they were more likely to go to bed at the same time and get up at the same time every morning. And we also had a questionnaire that's been validated where they also reported that they were better sleepers in general. So you might ask, which bacteria could these be? They turned out to be the bacteria that metabolize resistant starches into short-chain fatty acids, in particular butyrate-producing bacteria. And these bacteria are common across all of the 3 studies that I just mentioned. So that study only included predominantly white older men who are now 88, and we're very excited because those who have survived have come back and given another stool sample, so we'll be able to see how it changes with activity, what's going on. So we're learning a lot from these men, so thank you, Mr. Ross men across the country. But it doesn't address the rest of us who don't happen to be in that age group. So there is this American Gut Project that was started by Rob Knight down in San Diego. It's a crowd-funded project. You pay money, and then you get to give them your stool and all these samples and answer 1,000 questionnaires. But one of the things that was really important, and this slide is courtesy of Rob Knight, by the way, is that they found that people who reported that they ate more than 30 different plant foods each week compared to those who could only list 10 or fewer, had much healthier gut microbial profiles. And so this is a project that you had to think, I think you had to be 18 or over, and there was no upper age limit. So it really supported this idea of fresh fruits and vegetables. And I kind of joke, gosh, can you even think of 30 different fruits and vegetables? But it is possible, because it includes seeds and grains and legumes, so you'd be surprised. You couldn't get to 30, it's not that bad. But the other thing that they were able to show was what types of bacteria did these people who had the healthier gut microbiomes have. They had the bacteria that produced the short-chain fatty acids. So I'm going to just return back to that. I forgot to ask about those 2 women who you saw earlier, and you saw the slide and I didn't even reference to them, but basically they're both age 74. And I wanted to ask you before, do you think that supplements had anything to do with the difference in age span, that they're the same chronological age, and yet they look like they're from different decades? So the one who had all the muscles, she actually has been interviewed. She's turning 87 next month, and she looks pretty much very similar if the picture was up to date. She does not use supplements, okay, but she does eat a healthy diet, and she obviously works out with weights. In fact, she's famous for that. So circling back on also the beginning of what Stanford stands for in medicine, the dean has really pushed this idea, and we're well equipped to push the envelope for precision medicine. And when I think about that, what does that mean or precision medicine to treat diseases? And so diseases is in there, but what if aging is not a disease? Then what does that mean? So I've been going around saying, I think we should think about it, reframe it as precision health to help us. And in geriatrics, we don't think about chronological age. We really try to think about functional age. And we see that heterogeneity in our patients every day. So I can cite studies as a researcher, but all my geriatricians know that to be the truth. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I think, Jeff? Oh, one thing though, I must send a shout out to Jill Stanley and thanks to all the organizers of Health Matters for being here, and to all of you for showing up on a beautiful Saturday morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kado. Isn't she terrific? So we do have a number of questions. Yeah, please. We do have a number of questions already from the audience. And just as a reminder, there's a QR code on your program, or if you're online, it's on your computer screen. So I'll go ahead and launch into the questions. And it'd be fun to hear how you put these in the context of your 4 M's. Matters, mobility, memory, medicine.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think we're all on this path to maybe it's finding the fountain of youth, which is elusive, but maybe it's about the journey. And how do we translate your studies into practical day-to-day life? So how does sleep impact healthy aging? And what are some practical tips for improving the quality of sleep? And if you don't mind adding a little bit about the power nap.
The power nap. Okay, great question. Well, sleep is extremely important. And there are a lot of experts here at Stanford who spend a lot of time thinking about this. It turns out that circadian rhythms are very important for even our gene function, and that regularity that I pointed out is probably a marker of health. And so it does impact aging and healthy aging. And I guess practical tips that I've learned from some of the talks that I've attended here on sleep by the experts are, one, sometimes we get worried because we know that, oh my gosh, I have to be somewhere tomorrow, and I'm awake and it's 2 a.m. This is terrible. I'm just not going to be functioning. And then it kind of becomes a cycle that you're not asleep, and you should be sleeping because you know it's good for you. But in fact, what we see with these circadian rhythms is that all of us, if we actually listen to our bodies, do have these periods where our thresholds to fall asleep lower, so we tend to fall asleep. It just becomes problematic when it's more in the middle of the day. But to answer your question about power naps, if you have, you're tired, you also need to listen to your body. So I think it's okay if you need to take a short rest. And by power nap, I'm assuming you mean something like 15, 20, 30 minutes at most. But yes. And then the other thing I'd like to say about sleep is, one I learned from one of my colleagues is that a lot of people take something like Ambien because they can't sleep, right? And it says in the bottle, and your doctor says you should not be on this medicine for a long time, but then you're like, if I don't take it, then I can't sleep, and so it becomes this crazy cycle. And what they did is they actually compared in a trial Ambien users versus cognitive behavioral sleep therapy, and what they found over 6 months is that both groups improved their sleep. So if you took the pill, you slept better. If you participated in the cognitive behavioral therapy program, you did better. And then they stopped what they were doing because the study was over, but they bothered to follow them up at a year. And guess what? The people who were randomized to the Ambien had recurrent sleep problems, but the people who had participated in the cognitive behavioral therapy were still having a continued good sleep. So those are the things I'll say about sleep.
So behavioral practice matters.
Absolutely.
So can you talk about other practices that you suggest?
Oh, one thing I forgot to mention in the talk was today we're really fortunate to have experts in nutrition and the gut microbiome and cooking to come here. So I will first say diet is important. So I put it in the context of the gut microbiome, but I like to tell my patients, what you put in your mouth, your body has to process. So you should be thoughtful about what that is. And in general, we know from multiple studies from the blue zones, if you haven't heard of those are areas across the world where people are known for their longevity. They tend to eat fresh fruits and vegetables daily, and they minimize processed foods. So diet is one. The next thing is mobility, right? In the context, we really need to be mobile. So that old adage, use it or lose it, is totally true. So really using your body on a daily basis, not only worried about mobility, but also balance that can get worse with aging, and really challenging yourself in terms of balance so you can avoid the fall and then the fracture or other injuries. And then fermentation, actually keeping our minds clear, there are multiple things that we can do there. So diet and physical activity are actually important for both of those things, and studies have demonstrated that. But also attitude and purpose and getting out, doing things, happiness. And I forgot to mention that I wanted to end by talking about some of my centenarian patients and what are the things that they do, and what I've learned, because I've learned a lot from my patients over the years, is that all of them, 100%, have faced some significant adversity throughout their lives, 100%. And I would say 100% of them are pretty resilient. So resilience and attitude, not 100%, this is what made me think about it, is that those who are doing the best in terms of my 95 to 100 plusers are those who have this amazing feeling of optimism. They just are optimistic. And I'm thinking about a patient who's a vet who came to me because he had a vertebral fracture, but then was worried that he had to go see his wife who was in the hospital at the same time. And I said, well, how old is she? And he said, oh, she's 86. And I said, wow, you've been a cradle robber. But actually, this was his second wife. He lost his first wife to cancer when she was 50. And this other woman had only convinced him to remarry when he was 80. So they had been married, they were hiking partners. But he was someone who I found incredibly optimistic. He served in World War II, was shot up, had no skills. He said when he came back to the US in his early 20s, he had no skills except he knew how to kill people. And yet here he is. He was just an amazing guy. So optimism is key, and purpose. So he had a purpose. So that's just a little clip.
Thank you.
There's more stuff, but.
From the audience, do you have research on measuring biological age or the impact of interventions on biological age?
Yeah, so that's a good, so as a geriatrician, you can see I'm biased. I'm talking about functional age, but I'm happy to go with the biological age. I do have a small study where it was looking at women who had been newly diagnosed with breast cancer and was concerned about what the impacts of certain types of chemotherapeutic agents were doing to the rate of aging. So I wanted to look at telomere function, but that was not feasible and real. It was feasible in the cultures and the mice, but not in the humans. When we tried to look, and also on DNA methylation patterns, which have been linked to biological aging and the clocks. So yes, I have research. Has it really informed practice for today? I would say it's a little bit far away from that.
What do you suggest? Here's one for practice. What do you suggest for maintaining sexual health and libido into our later decades?
Woo! What a sexy question. Well. I can just say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink it. I don't know. I would say it has to do with desire. So I'm thinking about geriatrics patients I had at UCLA. I had this one older patient, and his wife was my patient too. And he's like, my God, she wants so much sex. I don't know what to do, Dr. Kado. Is this normal? You know. So I think we don't talk about it enough, because I think in Western culture, there's kind of this taboo, ooh, sex. But in fact, sex is alive and well for those who are older and want it. But cardiovascular health is also important for that. So if we're doing that, I suggest you get out and take a good walk, you run, you watch a sexy movie, you think about sex. All that will be more likely that you'll engage in it, and then you hopefully find an attractive partner too.
Terrific. Thank you. Let's go to building muscles. What do you think about exercise for building muscles? How does that relate to bone density? And then when it comes to replacing joints, how does the artificial knee, the artificial hip, and maybe in the future other artificial joints, how do they help us with a healthy, long life?
Yeah, so the majority of my research up until about 2016 was in musculoskeletal aging, and my practice has been in osteoporosis and metabolic bone disease. And I'd say for the past 4 or so years, I've really been focusing on the muscle and how important muscle strength and function is for bone health. There are a lot of biological similarities in terms of signaling, whether it's hormones or growth factors, et cetera, that are common between the muscle and the bone, and they're directly opposed. So it makes sense that there should be communication. Also, my patients have taught me that if they fracture and they have good muscle, they're going to recover from that fracture. It's not a downhill spiral necessarily. So if one is injured, it's really good to seek expert help, and oftentimes that would mean seeing your physician, physiatrist, physical therapist, and particularly if you're older, to realize that you can recover from this. And I love to use Tao Porchon Lynch. For those of you who don't know her, she's the Guinness Book World Records holder for the oldest yoga teacher. At age 93, she made it to 102. But I loved it because there's a picture of her balancing on her wrist like this at age 93 or 5 or something like this, something that I cannot do till this day. And she said, you know, I had a wrist fracture, I had a hip fracture, and all these things. So what you need to do is get help to learn how to, sometimes our bodies compensate on our own, and we'll just say, oh, we'll just ignore the shoulder injury, for instance, and not work on it because it hurts. You really need to work on it. You need to work on that area, keeping the injury in mind, but also knowing that you can recover from that injury. And the joint replacements work. So if your doctor is saying, well, you know what, I got an x-ray, you are bone on bone, and you're thinking it hurts to walk 10 feet, this is probably the time to think about getting a joint replacement.
Thanks. Now, you've mentioned yoga. I know there are several yoga sessions with the program today, and meditation. What are your feelings on meditation and yoga?
Okay, I'm the worst meditator, I'm just going to say, but I think it has a place. I think being mindful of where you are in space, I tell this a lot to my patients, that a lot of those falls that happen are because we're not being mindful and we're thinking about the next thing. So mindfulness is something that really is paramount when you're meditating, I think, right? Mm-hmm. You know, it's actually supposed to somehow ignore all those racing thoughts that are going through your head and you're standing, I don't know, it's tough. But meditation is really good. And in terms of yoga, I personally am a yoga doer, and I love it because it allows one to work on balance, core strengthening. You just have to be a little careful because some people get really excited and then they want to be the pretzel in the class, and that's when I see injuries. Maybe men more than women. This is why you have to be mindful when you're doing your yoga, to really listen to your body and do what feels right, but if you don't feel safe, to stop. Because if you do get an injury, it is a setback, and you have to get back to where you started.
So avoid the type A yoga. Right? So next question about alcohol and its effects. And this leads to, and its contribution to memory loss, dementia, but maybe there are two different topics, alcohol, and then we can talk about memory.
Okay, alcohol. Okay, I'm just gonna put the disclosure, I really enjoy drinking, okay?
Noted.
So, especially with good food. But I do think the preponderance of, I'll take from my geriatrics patients, moderation is good, right? So, for some people, maybe any alcohol is not good, but for others, it may be good. And a lot of the studies of large populations had suggested that, you know, a glass of wine or two a day over a lifetime is associated with better health. But and then getting beyond that, there are plenty of studies suggest that with more drinking, the risk of cancer in particular, for women, yes, memory decline, Alzheimer's could definitely go up, breast cancer, a lot of things are negative that are associated with alcohol as well. So it's a personal decision, but I will say that I definitely am mindful of not overdoing it. And certainly binge drinking is not great.
And in terms of dementia, Alzheimer's, are there any real preventive practices such as, you know, the crossword puzzle or games or learning, just continuous learning?
Yeah, very important. I think one thing we don't realize about our brains, we kind of think of us as getting, as we age, more restricted in what we plastic organ. It can develop new connections. And I think one of the things that I learned from going to Cilento, Italy, in an aging study is these nice people who are 95 and 100 allowed us to go into the country and measure their brains with MRIs to see. And I think the neurologists there, as well as the people who were from UC San Diego, we all kind of opened our eyes when we saw the brain image of this 99-year-old who was still driving in the roads that I wouldn't drive in, who was doing cane-back chairs as his profession still, or hobby, I guess, and his brain looked terrible. It looked like there was no brain in his MRI, but clearly he was functioning. And I think that's what geriatricians really appreciate, is that we can measure these things. Oh, you look like you have terrible degenerative spine disease, and you're like, oh my God, what happened? But you can look at that same x-ray in somebody else, and they're fine. I've never had a day of back pain in my life. So the measures are helpful, but that's not what's important as we age, I think.
Thank you. Next question is about severely limiting calorie intake. And does a strict calorie diet really help with longevity?
Okay, I will say that I was at UCLA with Roy Walford, who was one of the earliest proponents of caloric restriction, and did practice this on with this idea that you don't want to have too many oxidative products in your body. And then they did, this is the one where the study did come out. Actually, they did primates at the University of Wisconsin. One showed no benefit, but then I think the later one, oh yes, the poor monkey who was caloric restricted did survive a bit longer, but I always joked when I quipped to my husband, I saw the picture in the New York Times, like, well, that one doesn't look very happy. So, I don't know. I think it's a little extreme. Mm-hmm. I can bring up something else, though, that probably someone's thinking about,
Please.
Which is now a lot of people are doing intermittent fasting. And I'd say that's the latest fad right now. And I think there's science to back it up, particularly in mouse models and things like that. The one randomized controlled trial that came out earlier this year that was done in China didn't seem to show a benefit. But then again, you know, I think that's why I talk about heterogeneity in people, because we each come from our different circumstances and we have different underlying beliefs. So I'm thinking whatever makes someone feel good, I don't think it's unhealthy for you, but I personally like to eat when I'm hungry. But if it makes you feel better, and I've had a lot of patients say, oh, I lost like 30 pounds by, you know, cutting out breakfast. But breakfast is my favorite meal, but, you know, whatever suits them. So
you mentioned we're all different people. What's the role of genetics? And then if you know your genetics aren't great, then what?
Actually, so one of my colleagues, Tom Pearls, did do a centenarian study, and maybe like a lot of diseases, like osteoporosis, for example, we know is an inherited disease. What's the gene? It's a complex inherited disease. So I think it's been great that we can sequence the human genome, but it is not your path of what's necessarily going to happen to you health-wise.
So we have control.
Yeah, I think we'd love more control, but we do have control. We have control over actions. And and certainly those can affect outcomes, because there's this whole field of epigenetics, right? So what genes get expressed and what don't express are influenced by our environment and our actions, absolutely.
The next question, I think, hits the heart of much of your research. Can my bone health be improved without medication?
Okay, so the answer to that is yes, it can be improved without medication. But does that mean that you shouldn't take medication? Not necessarily, because starting in 1995, we've had FDA-approved medications that really help people prevent fractures by about 50%. But it's never the first thing I talk about with any of the patients who've ever come to see me. It always begins with lifestyle. What are you eating for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? To the point where some people have actually complained, like, I don't understand why Dr. Kado cares what I eat. But diet matters for bones as well, and so does activity. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Can you comment about NMN and NAD and longevity?
Oh, yeah. So So there's a product out there that you can get by a company. I think you can pay $60 a month, or if you buy more, you could maybe get a discount, that uses NNN to promote longevity. And it's been developed by really famous people, Nobel laureates, and in fact, maybe they're even taking this compound. But if you look, so this works in animal models, right? But does it work in humans? So what advice do we, what is the evidence in humans? Well, they studied 120 and randomized them to their basis, it's called basis, versus placebo, and guess what? Their NAD levels went up in their blood, and it was correlated with how much they took. So like, it works. The problem with that is that they also looked at things like metabolism, what was your glucose level, what was your blood pressure, did you walk any faster, and there were no differences between the groups. And we've seen this a lot in medicine, right, where we get excited about something. So back in the day, we used to think about homocysteine as being a big risk factor for heart disease, stroke, and maybe even cognitive decline. And you can lower homocysteine if you take B vitamins. And certainly, if you give people B vitamins against placebo, their homocysteine levels will go down. So it worked. But fast forward another 10 years when they did about 11 randomized controlled trials around the country, the world, and they saw no benefit in terms of cardiovascular disease or stroke or cancer. So we don't measure homocysteine so much anymore.
And can you talk more about how the medicine and the interpretation and the practice all goes in fads in and out of favor over time? You touched on it earlier.
Yeah, well, as you said, Jeff, I don't know. I think I forgot in my talk to talk about the fact that whether age is a disease has been an age-old question for centuries, and we've always been looking for the fountain of youth. So, Seneca, the Roman philosopher, said age is old, age is definitely a disease, and Plato said no. Remind me your question again. Oh,
just about the fads in and
fads.
The fads in medicine and the fads in the way people interpret.
So there have been fads over the centuries, and J.O. Skansky, who's from the University of Chicago and a longevity expert, did a very nice job in some of his writings talking about the different people who've purported different things that could extend lifespan. And unfortunately, the longest lived one was, I think he did live to 98 in the 1400s, and he did talk about diet as being important. And also like not being overindulgent. So King Henry VIII was not the way to go. But yeah, so I think that's life cycles through history.
I think you've already mentioned vitamin D, but how can you measure the vitamin D levels, and how do they actually correlate with health and aging?
Ooh. These are like separate lectures. Okay, vitamin D is actually complicated. So the one we measure clinically is our bodily storage form that's very stable. And I am more and more convinced that it's not a really good marker of very much, except in certain extreme cases, specialized cases. And basically, they keep on moving the question. Can you go back to the question?
About vitamin D.
Yeah, correlate with health. So the level doesn't really correlate with health and aging. We've done studies in multiple populations that have been on both sides. So it in and of itself, but I'd say with the negative trials that have come out on 25,000 people for bone health and everything else, there are two areas that are interesting. One is in immunity. They're for the active hormone, very important for immune function. I do believe that. And it is important for bone health if it's really too low. We develop rickets, for example, in soft bones. Okay.
We're almost at the end of our time, but maybe two quick questions.
Okay.
One, if someone, and this is from the audience, if someone is on meds, it's difficult to exercise. How do you start if you want to live a healthy life? How do you get back on track?
I love this question because sometimes people come in and they're like, oh, it's all over now. I haven't made great decisions and it's just too late. But studies actually show that you can make a decision. at any time. It's your choice, and that people can make these changes late in life and sometimes see the greatest benefits. So you probably would go to see a specialist, figure out which medications are really necessary, which may not be, and then to start slow. You don't want to just dive in right away, but have this attitude that it's possible and begin slowly with each day and say, today is a new day, and I set a goal that's obtainable, and you might surprise yourself. So that woman who was a muscle builder, she was not a regular exerciser until in her 50s she lost her sister from a brain aneurysm, and that changed her outlook in life, and you can see where she is at 87 now.
Right. Well, we have so enjoyed getting to know you, listening to you, and having you answer these questions. So one final question. What tip do you have for your children on what to do now to live a nice, long, healthy life?
Yeah, so in geriatrics we say everything is multifactorial, but you said tip. So I'm going to just say one, and I think it applies. I think regardless of what age you are, to really think about purpose. That if you have purpose, then that is a great guiding force to everything else.
All right. Well, thank you very much.